Today I'm going to show you guys how to make this cute kawaii cactus cake. So there's quite a few layers used to make this cake, and I started off by making the pot that the cactus sits on top of. So to make this entire cake, I used 2 batches of my favorite vanilla layer cake recipe. It's up on Chelsweets.com, and I've also linked the tutorial on how to make it up in the upper right corner. Once the layers were stacked, I trimmed them using a serrated knife and then applied a crumb coat using the same terracotta colored frosting that I used to fill the cake. Once my crumb coat was smoothed, I chilled the cake for about 10 minutes in the freezer, and then I began to work on my second thicker layer of frosting. To get this shade of frosting, I mixed together 2 types of AmeriColor food gel coloring. So they actually make one that's called terracotta, but it was a little bit too brown, so I added in some orange gel food coloring as well to get this shade. And just like always, whenever I'm working with a curved cake, I love using an acetate sheet to get those lines really nice and smooth. So we've been building this upside down to make it easier to shape, and now it's time to flip it over. So I made sure my cardboard rounds were nice and aligned, and then I carefully flipped it using both hands. To pop off the cardboard cake round, I used a small offset spatula and carefully ran it around the cake to separate the frosting from the cake board. I placed my remaining frosting into a small piping bag and cut an opening of about 1.5 centimeters. I then carefully piped a border around the edge of the cake. I used a small offset spatula just to smooth where those lines come together. Next, I piped some black cocoa frosting inside of the pot to kind of act as the base for the dirt. I used a small offset spatula to smooth this, and then I placed some Oreos on top of it to really give this some fun texture. The last step is to insert some small dowels into the cake because the cactus that we're going to be placing on top of it is going to be pretty heavy, and we want to make sure that it's properly supported. So to allow the cactus to sit on top of those dowels, we're going to be building it on a 6-inch cake board. So like I mentioned earlier, this cactus is going to be pretty big. It's made with 6 of these 6-inch cake layers, and I've colored them green using just a little bit of green gel food coloring. I added a generous layer of my American buttercream between each of these layers and stacked all of them until they were nice and tall. To make sure that they're pretty aligned, I used a really tall bench scraper that I have that's made by Wilton just to do a sense check and make sure they were pretty straight. Because this cake is so tall, I added a thick wooden dowel into the center of the layers to keep them aligned while I trimmed and frosted the cactus, and also to give the cake stability once it's stacked. Next, I trimmed the top edge of our top layer just to make it easier to make a rounded top for our cactus. I also trimmed the sides a bit while I was doing this, and of course did a little taste test along the way. Once the layers were trimmed, I added on some buttercream to create our crumb coat. And this just helps lock in all of the crumbs from those trimmed layers so that our second layer of frosting can be nice and smooth. I chilled the cake in the freezer for about 10 minutes and then added on a second, thicker layer of green buttercream. So this layer doesn't have to be perfect because we're actually going to be piping over it in a minute, but you do want to get it as smooth as you can. So I used this 10-inch Wilton bench scraper for the sides and an acetate sheet to smooth out the top. Next, we have to add on the arms of the cactus, and in order to secure these, I'm adding some wooden dowels into the cake at kind of a diagonal angle. You want to insert these far enough into the cake so that they're nice and secure, but you also need to leave enough dowel hanging out so that you can add the cupcakes onto them. I then piped a very generous amount of buttercream around these cupcakes, and I really recommend piping the frosting onto this because if you try to just spread it using an offset spatula, it can be too much force and it can tear your cupcakes. Once the cupcakes were fully covered in frosting, I very carefully spread and smoothed out the buttercream using a small offset spatula. And then things get exciting as we transfer the cactus on top of our planter. I cut a hole in our 6-inch cake round so I can push the dowel through it and secure it into our planter. Next, we need to give this cactus a little bit of texture, so we're piping vertical lines using a Wilton 4B tip. And this is really just a medium-sized French tip. I broke up my vertical lines when I got to the arms of the cactus and then continued to pipe vertical lines around them. You want to try to make these as straight as possible, but because of the texture on the tip, these lines are pretty forgiving. I used a small offset spatula to remove the excess buttercream from the cactus's arms and near the dowel. To cover up our exposed dowel and to give this cake a little more spunk, I piped a flower on top using a Wilton 1M tip and a bit of pink buttercream. The last step to this Kawaii Cactus cake is to add on the adorable eyes and mouth. I made these with fondant the night before and allowed them to harden before adding them to the cake. A cake this cute deserves to be cut by a special knife, so I'm using this iridescent green knife that I actually got from my friend Mr. Crisp. I'm cutting through the top 3 layers just to give you guys a glimpse of what the inside of the cake looks like. Thanks so much for watching. If you guys enjoyed this tutorial, be sure to click the like and subscribe buttons below. And also don't forget to let me know what tutorials you'd like to see next.